Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Kerridge and Partners webinar series. My name is Renisa Peterson and I am a consultant with the firm. As part of our vision to transform the leadership landscape, we have been working on a series of leadership events and embracing these current digital times have launched these online. Thank you to everyone who has been attending our webinar series over the last few weeks. They have certainly picked up momentum and sparked conversations online, spanning topics on leadership in crisis, talent development, and CEO succession. We wanted to pivot slightly and evolve a new theme of webinars, reflecting on the current context. In light of the COVID-19 crisis, we can see that New Zealand has led the world in terms of successfully managing the crisis. There is a real focus on Kiwi leadership on a global stage. We think there is no better time than now to showcase the best of New Zealand leadership through a series of conversations with Kiwis who are making a difference to the world and learn from them what it is about us that sets us apart as leaders. We wish to explore our Turanga Waiwai here in New Zealand, the places where we feel especially empowered and connected, our place in the world. We are delighted you are joining us today for our inaugural webinar on this leadership theme with renowned futurist Roger Dennis. An accomplished international speaker and strategist, he co-led the Shell Technology Futures program in The Hague. He has been on the core team for Future Agenda, the world's largest foresight program, and has been published in the Financial Times and Scientific American. Roger has put in a special request that your questions today be provocative. He welcomes a curveball. For context on who is with us online as part of this community, we have over 180 people, and 20% of you are CEOs, 20% are professional directors, including chairs, and the rest are a cohort of senior executives from a broad range of sectors. Haere mai. Some housekeeping matters to address. Firstly, you have all joined this webinar on mute, and please rest assured you're not on video, so you can sit back and relax. You will remain on mute by default, so no need to stress about background noise either. We will also be uploading a recording of this website to our website and also share the slide deck if relevant, so no need to worry about writing too many notes. There is a link on our website with all future webinar recordings as well. Secondly, we encourage you to participate by asking questions throughout this session. On the bottom of your screen, there is a Zoom chat function button, Q&A. Please type in your questions and we will address the most popular ones during our Q&A session, which I will expand on shortly. Please can we request that you send your questions using the Q&A function instead of the general Zoom chat function. Thirdly, we wanted to share the structure of our webinar today so you know what to expect. Following introductions, Roger will be delivering a presentation and screen share with us all. Jane Atherton will then join us to host a Q&A session with Roger. Jane is a consultant with the firm working in the governance practice. She has had a 20-year career as an award-winning national news, business and finance journalist and senior editor in the UK and New Zealand, working across newspapers and digital. She was also a regular contributor to Sky News, BBC Radio and television. We will then all reconvene to put forward questions coming through from all of you as delegates straight to Roger. So without further ado, please welcome Roger.
Kia ora, and thank you for that introduction. Just to clarify, first of all, make apologies for informal clothing. I'm not trying to do a Dominic Cummings, but I am constrained by what I can wear due to that injury at the weekend. So just bear that in mind. So I'd like to share my screen now, take you through some of my thinking around where this is going. But first of all, before I take you forward, as a futurist does, I want to take you sort of back and really go back to 2015 when I did a piece of work around where I saw a substantial threat to New Zealand and indeed to the globe, and led a piece of work for about 4 months where we analysed the impact of a pandemic on New Zealand. Now, you can actually access this report still. It's in public domain, hosted by both the McGuinness Institute in Wellington and also by Z Energy, which co-sponsored the report. And the report itself is about 140 pages, but to save you wading through that, I can sort of summarize it in a format that really won't surprise you, which was that we're pretty badly prepared for a pandemic. Now, the interesting thing about this report is you can see it's sort of deliberately low key in its presentation, and we did that purposefully as to not cause alarm, because what we saw at the time was quite concerning. And the challenge with trying to highlight to people what might happen in a pandemic is that everything you do before a pandemic seems alarmist, and everything you do afterwards seems inadequate. So back in January, that was highly relevant, and I was talking to clients of mine and advising that something really odd was happening. Several of those clients set up crisis management teams and have navigated with varying degrees of success through this. And what we're seeing now is a resultant crisis which exceeds the scale of where I thought it might go. And when that happens, that's always a concern, because the nature of my work is to have a fairly active imagination. So I want to talk to you about actually the scale of this to put some of the conversation in context. And so, and one of the things that I would always talk to leadership teams and boards about over the last 4 or 5 years is that the list of risks on the global risk register was literally off the page. So you could look around key sources and you would find a long, long litany of challenges and potential crises that could blow up. And one of the slides I always used to show was this one, which essentially says, you don't know who's skinny dipping until the tide goes out. So people get stuck in paradigms, and they're always quite happy to stay in those paradigms unless challenged by external shocks. We're in the middle of one of those now, and the shock is substantial and almost unprecedented. So let's look at the scale and size of that shock. So one of the things you can do is sort of look back in history and say, you know, what have we got to compare this with? And so if you look back, for example, at the GFC, which a lot of people are doing right now, you can see some precedent, particularly in the States, for how this is evolving. But it doesn't quite match what's going on now. And to put that in context, what you'll see is, you know, in the States in June 2008, people worried about 50,000 people going for unemployment benefits. And what we've seen just in the last few days is that number is completely dwarfed. So 3 million Americans seeking unemployment benefits. This is just off the charts in terms of when you're looking for historical precedents. Now, the other interesting thing is that although this is primarily a health crisis, you're seeing all these flow-on effects, such as unemployment, and then you'll see second and third order impacts start to sort of raise their influence in potentially unexpected ways. This is quite a logical extension now coming through. So Bloomberg yesterday reported massive increases in loan defaults. So very similar to the GFC, where subprime was a trigger. Now you've got subprime auto loans in the States as a potential trigger. You were seeing missed loan payments on houses, another trigger. And I think what you're going to see is some ripples start to hit through the economy very, very shortly in the States, and then flow on to the rest of the world. And in the rest of the world, the picture isn't really any better. So you would have seen probably this headline from a few days ago, where the Bank of England warned that the UK was facing the biggest depression on record, and the Bank of England's records go back 300 years. So this is, you know, big by any means, and really heading into, you know, true meaning of unprecedented. Now, every few days to try and get a handle on different global lenses, I get on a call with colleagues around the world. So I talk with a very senior leader in a highly respected, influential Washington think tank, world complexity expert, a very senior and influential civil servant in Asia, and a top foresight practitioner from the Middle East. Because one of the things I want to do is trying to understand how this is evolving in real time around the world, as opposed as to the sort of inside out view we get from New Zealand, where it's very easy to sort of fall into the paradigm that things are heading back to normal. And I want to take you through a handful of issues that have come out of those calls that myself and colleagues are watching reasonably closely right now, because like I say, in New Zealand, it's quite easy to default back to where things are going. But the first thing to be aware of is that the key factor that will drive the world for the next 6 to 12 months is knowledge of the virus. So that dictates everything, because no one is really sure what's going on with vaccination development, with immunity, with reinfection, with asymptomatic spread, etc. And to give you context around that, about 2 weeks ago in Wuhan, there was a cluster that emerged. And what was interesting about that cluster was that Wuhan had no cases for 30 days, and it's the most sanitized, disinfected, and controlled city in the world, bar none. And they still had a cluster emerge. So knowledge of the virus will be the number one thing that dictates the shape of the world for the next 6 to 12 months. And anybody that tells you that a vaccine is on the way within that time frame is dreaming. And that's because there's one thing to have vaccine candidates, another thing for Bill Gates to be funding billions of dollars of vaccine manufacturing capability, but quite another thing to figure out how to globally manufacture and distribute that in a way that gives equality and fairness through a rapidly crumbling globalized economy. Next thing, in the USA, what you're seeing is divides really starting to become apparent in all sorts of ways. This image could well be the image of 2020. If you didn't see it, essentially what it was protests in some American states where people really wanted just to get out of lockdown. And in one city, clinicians came out in full scrubs and stood their ground against these protesters. And it was quite extraordinary. So you're seeing divides on the Republican Democrats. You're seeing divides against urban, rural, against elites versus the masses, science versus sort of post-truth, etc. And these divides will be another factor that shapes where America goes. And where America goes at the moment looks to be in a steep decline. On another part of the world, what you're seeing is that China will leverage this to the maximum. So China is really sitting back almost in surprise and shock, I would say, firstly from Trump's removal of America from the world stage, and then America and Europe's handling of this, which really has handed China an opportunity to increase its presence on the world stage quite significantly. So you're seeing Chinese aid going out to smaller countries that comes with strings around social media commentary or mainstream media praise for China. You're seeing this Belt Road Initiative starting to pick up in some countries with Chinese development coming through. You're seeing the spat across the Tasman right now with Australia starting to pick sides between the US and China when it comes to trade. And that will also shape the world quite materially for the next few months, if not few decades. You're seeing unpredictability in how this is going to evolve. So, in my job, what I typically do is try and imagine where the world might go possibly in the next 10 to 15 years and how organizations navigate that. We are now in a scenario that I wouldn't have thought plausible even in February. And so when things go outside the bounds of my imagination, alarm bells go off for me. So this is really happening because what we're seeing is complex systems evolving in unpredictable ways. Complex systems by their nature are unpredictable. And when you see multiple complex systems interacting, what you have now is a world that's reshaping in ways that we can't really understand. But ways in which will only be clear in hindsight. So historians always have field days looking back at history, but when you try and predict forward in times like this, it's almost impossible to understand where things could go. And if you want reassurance around that statement, just look back at media commentary in January about the outbreak of a small virus in Wuhan and see how fast that's evolved. Those complex systems interact in unpredictable ways means that you have a challenge trying to get useful insight. And so what I've seen is that domain experts are really out of their depth, because what we have is these complex systems interacting. And so normally I would use the analogy of cogs. With a broken hand, it's quite difficult to do the cog analogy. But these cogs interacting in ways that are really difficult to understand right now around virus spread, country reaction, geopolitical plays, etc. And when you talk to economists, for example, I've talked to quite a few very well-respected economists in the States over the last 2 or 3 weeks. I have been surprised, and I shouldn't have been, but surprised at how their deep knowledge and expertise in their chosen field does not give me any new insight around how this is going to play out, because these are complex systems. So domain experts are really getting out of their depth. What I'm seeing is that people who are familiar and comfortable working in ambiguity and complexity are people that offer fresh insights around how this is going to work and how you need to think about how to behave in the situation. Also, what you're seeing is, as part of that, is that governance systems do not respond well to complexity. People want to naturally fall back to their own knowledge base and to try and stretch that out to apply to the current situation. But those domains of knowledge just cannot be applied right now with any certainty. And so you're seeing these governance failures starting to cascade around the world, because these systems are moving in ways that just can't be foreseen. However, you look at all that and you think, oh my God, this is the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and New Zealand's basically screwed. And that's one view you could take. But I'm a bit of a realistic optimist. And so what I think is actually there's an entirely different view you can take, which is actually we've got this amazing opportunity on the world stage, because we are potentially the first English-speaking developed country to emerge almost COVID-free and potentially stay that way. And so what I'm really interested in is, how does New Zealand as a whole actually leverage this to create a platform from which New Zealand can grow for decades? And that's really around, what is the New Zealand that my grandchildren are going to inherit? What's it going to look like? I don't have grandchildren yet. My kids are, all at school still. And that forces you to think, multi-generation timeframes. What's the opportunity going to look like? And so, that starts to force you to think about how this would work, both in terms of public sector and private sector, and conversations about creating visions. And people from Christchurch are very familiar with this conversation, because we had it many years ago with the rebuild. And so now that New Zealand's facing another disaster, there are lots of lessons to be learned here. And I'll give you some context around that, but bear in mind that Christchurch was a local disaster while the rest of the country functioned. What we have now is a national economic disaster while the rest of the world continues to melt down. So that's really important to bear in mind, because what the biggest challenge is how to get government officials to move fast and not to try and revert back to a business as usual mindset. So if you're not from Christchurch or not familiar with the story of the Christchurch rebuild, this is what was envisaged would develop from the rebuild. This is a plan called the Blueprint, and it was the grand plan for how New Zealand, for how Christchurch would look. coming up to almost a decade later, about $1.5 billion of key infrastructure as designated by this blueprint still has yet to be completed. One of those pieces of infrastructure is a $500 million convention centre, which even 3 or 4 years ago, I was looking at and wondering, what if the real price of carbon gets factored into flights? Who's going to want to travel to conferences anymore? But yeah, we have this $500 million white elephant now emerging, and that won't be used in Christchurch for at least 2 or 3 years. Because as we're heading into a global depression, who's going to actually have the spare resources to fund what might be seen as a luxury in the next 2 or 3 years, as you're really focusing on essential business activities rather than potentially frivolous conferences? So, during the rebuild of Christchurch, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of ideas put up for what would be applicable, how we could reinvent cities and change all sorts of things. And of those ideas, maybe 10, 15%, if I'm generous, were actually usable, tangible ideas that policymakers and regulators get their hands around. And then of those, maybe 5% made it through the bureaucratic filter, maybe 1% got looked at. And the ideas that were the most successful that came out of Christchurch rebuild weren't top down from the national government at the time, they were bottom up from citizens, things like student volunteer army, gap filler, etc. And I remember quite clearly a conversation I had with a bureaucrat when I was working on a project called Sensing City. And it was about 4 or 5 years into the rebuild. And she said, and she was quite a senior bureaucrat at the time, she said, Christchurch will emerge really well from this, Roger. She said, it's got the port, it's got an Antarctic gateway, it's got the Banksy art exhibition, and it's got Sensing City. And I said to her, the way Sarah is going with Sensing City, it won't be around much longer. So you're telling me we're going to spend $30 billion of taxpayer money to maintain a port, an Antarctic centre, and an art exhibition. So one of the lessons that I took from that was that actually you need to have, rather than just this total blizzard of ideas, you need to have a way of separating all the signal from the noise, and a way in which you can do that in a structured manner so that domain experts can actually put some credible commentary around what ideas might be useful to apply in this climate and what potentially you should ignore. And so with that, I've just recently launched this site, which is called A New New Zealand, and it's specifically targeted at involving subject matter experts in the agricultural and primary industry sectors, in tourism and technology, to say what are some of the key ideas and initiatives that make sense for government to look at, that can be inspirational for small and medium enterprises to wrap their head around, and how does the New Zealand economy emerge stronger from this crisis, because there is an extraordinary opportunity for New Zealand right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. I was interested in you talking about vision. Everyone's talking about vision. There's even a vision week in next month. Is this the answer to the unpredictability that you talk about?
Yeah, visions are really interesting things. And in the corporate world, many organizations like to pursue the idea of creating a vision for an organization. And that can work really well when you have the right conditions to do that. And in that context, an organizational ecosystem is probably bounded enough for you to create a vision and execute on that. The challenge with a vision for a country, in a country like New Zealand, is that, throughout our history, Kiwis have usually rebelled from visions. And so there's been really well-meaning efforts to look at what New Zealand should do in the future and what's a vision for the country. So there was the Commission for the Future, and there's been a whole host of these sort of initiatives. If you're interested in this, I would recommend having a look at the the website of the very excellent McGuinness Institute in Wellington. It's done a big piece of research around New Zealand's attempts to be more forward-thinking in the future. But I'm not sure that creating a vision that involves 5 million people would be viable or actionable. And really the closest thing New Zealand's had to a vision the last 10, 20 years has been the 100% pure label. And the end result of that is that I still can't swim in some rivers. I'm not so sure that's a good path to go down. What I think is really useful in this space is that the private sector starts to translate some of those intrinsic values that Kiwis value into business opportunities and start to move in that direction faster than the government can allow or mandate.
And how can they practically do that? I mean, if you're a business leader, you're thinking about how to navigate the path ahead. And you can't do it on your own. This is much too big. You've already pointed to scale. What's your next step in the sector that you operate in?
So I'll answer it by going to a macro level first. I think what's needed now for New Zealand is a joint approach between the public sector and the private sector to navigate New Zealand through this. And the reason for doing that is pretty clear. So the private sector, for want of a better phrase, likes to move fast and break things. It can take risks. It can do things which would cripple the public sector because bureaucrats are afraid of the front page test. And the public sector, on the other hand, can do things which the private sector would balk at. And in Christchurch, the example is cycleways. So in the rebuild, cycleways are quite a material part of how the city moves around now. But in the immediate aftermath of the quakes, there was a big pushback from the private sector around cycleways, people saying that people wouldn't come into town, that cars were the way forward. But what you're seeing around the world is climate change initiatives to reduce private car use, to move to mobility as a service, etc., mean that cycleways are actually really important. So you need to have a combined approach with public and private sector, and there's a precedent for this. So in Australia, they've actually set up, I can't remember if it's a working group or some commission, but it essentially is public and private sector coming together to try and have Australia emerge stronger for this. And so there's a precedent for this because Rob Fife was embedded in the crisis centre. He just actually emerged from that in the last couple of days, but he was in there almost for 5 weeks straight and coordinating private sector efforts to help the government move fast. So there is a precedent for doing this in an emergency, and I think the government would be wise to think about doing that going forward and planning how New Zealand emerges stronger by working together in a very material way.
And who's going to instigate that then? Is that the government, or is there something that private business can do to get that going?
I think in this environment, the current government isn't sure about how to interact with the private sector. And I think that there is definitely space for that conversation and for that approach to be made around how New Zealand can benefit from both public and private working together very constructively. The challenge is we're heading into a election cycle now, and election cycles aren't characterised by forward-thinking moves.
In the Christchurch situation, we had the Stronger Christchurch infrastructure rebuild team, for example, with a massive $2 billion budget. Now, some of the criticism that came out of that was that private businesses were just almost paralysed by the scale of the crisis and just couldn't move fast enough. Do you think that's a risk in having something similar in approach to this particular problem?
That's a great question. And one of the really interesting things, one of the lessons that came out of Christchurch is the difference between a government-led reaction versus a well thought out response. And so the contrast between SCIRT, which we'll talk about in a minute, is EQC. So EQC, where officials simply tried to scale up the bounds of limited knowledge and change the organisation from a a fee collecting group into something which was managing complex billion-dollar budgets for rebuild just failed spectacularly. And the Royal Commission has come out with its findings, earlier this year, which highlighted that. So the flip side of that is SCIRT, which, although it had a terrible acronym, actually performed pretty well. And to give context to that, I had a colleague who was involved in the establishment of SCIRT, and what they did initially was sort of ignore all the pressure to simply start digging to restore the below ground horizontal infrastructure. They locked themselves in a room for 3 months and looked at how they would go faster when they started work. Looked at best practice from around the world, how they would use data, frameworks for hooking other projects into. And when they actually pushed the button 3 months later, they went 5 times faster than the Christchurch City Council had ever managed to move in its best year. So on one hand, you've got EQC that resulted in a Royal Commission. On the other hand, you've got SCIRT, which got international engineering awards and went 5 times faster using a joined up approach between public and private sector.
It's quite a burden though, isn't it, on businesses when they've got so much to cope with. There'll be firefighting, they'll be trying to navigate a path ahead. And you're also asking them to lobby for change and a new way forward. What would you say to them, practically speaking? I know that earlier you touched on crisis management teams in place. Is that the answer? Is there anything else that could be done? What should their approach be?
So on a practical note, organisations need to be thinking about 3 strands of work simultaneously. So the first is, the immediate response to the crisis. And now we've sort of emerged from lockdown, a lot of that work will have been done. The next simultaneous strand that you need to think about is, how do you stay 4 to 6 weeks ahead of this? So a separate team looking at a rolling plan, not a fixed plan, that tries to anticipate where the immediate business as usual work stream needs to start working towards. The third piece of work that needs to go simultaneously, and this is perhaps the most difficult in the New Zealand environment, is where is the world going? And that's really important because you need to understand the bigger picture. Where is the world going? What does it mean for our industry and our sector? And then what are the right strategic questions that we need to be asking? And so when you start thinking along those sort of frames, you have 3 separate groups working simultaneously on how your organisation starts to emerge stronger from this. You can't have them all working on the same problem because the complexity of the situation means that it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for one group to have all 3 of those streams of work going at the same time. But by physically separating out the allocation of responsibility, you'll get a lot further in the line than you would any other way. Now, the challenge I mentioned for the New Zealand business environment is that the vast majority, like 97% of our organisations, are in the SME space. And they simply don't have the resources to do this. And so in that situation, you sort of fall back on agility and resilience. And New Zealand has this rich legacy of innovation behind it, where that size actually becomes an advantage in a crisis as opposed to a disadvantage.
I was interested in your position on domain experts and how they don't have all the answers. If they don't have the answers, where are the answers going to come from?
Yes, and so I might answer that by going a little bit back first. So a couple of years ago, I gave a speech, and I only gave it once because I didn't want to appear too alarmist, about where things were going on the risk register. And so when I gave that speech, I sort of finished it with this sort of story about a turkey. And the story goes that this turkey's on a farm in the States. Every morning, wakes up, talks to advisors, how's the day going? What's ahead? And everyone tells him, the day is fantastic. We've got food coming in. We've got all our mates around. There's no work to do. It's great. Turkey has a good day. Next day, wakes up, how's things? Advisors say the same thing. It's great, food's coming in, all our friends are here, it's awesome. This pattern continues until the night before Thanksgiving. And the reason I tell that story is because what you should look at as an organization is what were your trusted advisors telling you in December and January and last year? You know, were they talking about resilience, agility, the need to think about a coming crisis? Or were they saying, it's great, just carry on? Because what I'm seeing now is organizations sort of rehashing and trotting out advice that they would have dished out in pre-crisis times and repackaging that is how you should manage your way through this. And my feedback on that is if they were giving you that advice pre-crisis and weren't thinking about agility of response and crisis management and scenarios, then why would you listen to the advice they're giving you now about how to operate in a crisis?
And you talked about governance maybe not being up to spec now. What can boards do you think, to support executive teams in charting the way forward?
Now, that's an excellent question. And I don't think there's a sort of off-the-cuff answer to that. Definitely giving management teams the license to work on those 3 different streams simultaneously would go a long way to helping managers and chief execs navigate this. Having an increased appetite and recognition of ambiguity and complexity is also a really good place to start. And resisting the need to fall back to exact answers. So I think it's far better to have an approximate answer to the right question than the exact answer to the wrong question.
I know that you're not just a futurist, but you're an optimist as well. There's a lot of talk about how the situation that New Zealand's in gives us a massive opportunity to do great things and to rebuild our economy a lot faster than other parts of the world. What are your thoughts about the opportunities that are out there for us?
It's really interesting that as a nation, you can't be a prophet in your own land in New Zealand. So Kiwis love to hear people from outside look at New Zealand and go, you should do this or you should do that. So Simon Cooper in the FT wrote a piece about 3 weeks ago highlighting that New Zealand had an extraordinary opportunity, and on the world stage it was totally unique. And that post went completely nuts. So I put it on LinkedIn. I thought it was really good commentary. And so, you know, the opportunity for New Zealand really is, how do we leverage that position on the world stage? How do we see ourselves through an international lens, and what can we do? So in that article, for example, Simon Cooper talked about, you know, businesses should relocate to New Zealand. I'm not sure that's realistic or possible, but I think it's entirely realistic for R&D teams to be moved down to New Zealand in such a way that New Zealand becomes a magnet for talent, and organisations can carry on with their R&D in a way that you couldn't do anywhere else in the world, bring their families down here, and then in 2 or 3 years' time, they might not leave. So in terms of New Zealand becoming a magnet for talent, which is a really key driver for productivity for us, you know, that's a really tangible opportunity on the world stage. And you're already seeing some of that start to evolve with the film industry. We were seeing some of the commentary in the last few days about some of the lead team for the Avatar productions coming into New Zealand under special exemptions. So essentially, they are people that can't do that role remotely who need to be physically present. And if you think about that across a whole number of industries, there's going to be a need and a demand for that very shortly. And New Zealand should look at that as one of the first cabs off the rank in terms of opportunity.
Interesting idea, Roger. Thank you. I think now might be a good time to take some questions from our audience.
Thank you, Jane and Roger. We've had quite a number of questions and comments come through, and you've both certainly sparked food for thought. Roger, you'd asked for provocative questions, and I believe they have come.
I may regret that now.
To launch them, the first one for you, Roger. How well equipped do you think governments and organizations are to ramp up their ability to respond and adapt to this rapidly changing environment? Any who you think will be better or worse than others?
So there's two parts to that question. So the first part is how well are governments prepared, and I think most governments are very badly prepared, and there's a temptation for us in New Zealand to go, you know, it's a Labor government, it's a new government, they're inexperienced, you know, they might not handle it so well, and you know, although the PM's done extremely well in the sort of the kindness and support during lockdown, that, you know, post-lockdown the plan might not emerge well. Now, I don't think that is a Labor versus a national issue. I think that's an issue of strength of bureaucracy in New Zealand. So to put that in context, a family friend of mine graduated from Oxford University in the early 60s, extremely successful entrepreneur, built a massive business in Asia. He was telling me 2 or 3 years ago an insight which has really stuck with me. He said when he graduated, and he's a smart guy, he said all of his smartest friends didn't want to work in business, they all wanted to work in government. So all his very smart colleagues all went to work for the UK government. And he said to me, who would do that today? So if you look at our brightest and best graduates, who is queuing up to work for government? And that is reflected in conversations I've had in the last few weeks, because virtually since February, I've been sort of neck deep in a whole bunch of responses around ventilator manufacturing, thermal camera production, drive-through testing, etc., and had first-hand contact with a whole range of senior officials and ministers on the response. But some officials have said to me quietly, you know, the reason, you know, these people work in government is because they have no imagination, no creativity, Roger. And I thought that's an astonishing, you know, acknowledgement. People probably would know some of that already, but there really needs to be an upskilling of government officials to change the course of New Zealand over the next couple of decades. So you asked around countries that do this well. So I've worked alongside, you know, senior officials in Singapore for a number of years, especially in their foresight teams. And Singapore does this very well because what they do is they identify smart kids at school, offer them undergraduate degrees fully paid for by the government. They finish that, and then they are offered postgrad anywhere in the world on any subject they like. And then when they come back, they're given officer training in the army. So you have very smart leaders emerging into the civil service. And very early on in my interactions with the Singapore government, I learned that when you're sitting at a table with a group of people, always look at their bios first, because around the room you've got, you know, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, Stanford. And these people understand complexity, ambiguity, you know, response, the business environment, and they are a completely different level to bureaucrats and we have in New Zealand. So Asian countries have done well, Western countries not so well.
Interesting. The next question, Roger, is, given that you say bottom-up was most effective generator of ideas, who are some of the groups you see emerging this time round that might be developing those ideas, or aren't there any yet?
So it's very Darwinistic, and that's what happened in Christchurch as well. So you had not quite competing ideas, but lots of ideas bubbling up organically. And we're going to see the same thing again. And already it's starting to appear. There's Vision Week. There's all sorts of initiatives from different groups trying to raise ideas. And ministers I've talked to, cabinet ministers, are already overwhelmed. They already don't know where to look, what to pick, how to engage, because it's a blizzard of ideas. I mean, literally, there's just so much coming out. And that's one of the reasons why I set up a new New Zealand, to try and filter that down to a handful of really well-informed comments about what we could do. But that's an experiment. So I'll run it for a few months, see how it goes. If it doesn't resonate anymore, but it's resonating strongly now, then I'll probably shut it down. But at the moment, it seems to be hitting a nerve. And so if you're interested after this chat, then go and have a look at A New Zealand. anew.nz is the website. That is the challenge. How do you filter ideas, especially ones coming through from the private sector? That's why Rob Fife was in the Crisis Management Centre during lockdown. And that's why I think there needs to be this joined up approach going forward between the public and private sectors.
Thank you. I think this next one's probably one of the most provocative. And it's also anonymous, so that's a good sign as well. It says,
I'm bracing myself already.
it says, have we overreacted? Is this virus and the response by the world in line with the threat of the virus?
Right. So, not provocative. I think that's a really good question to ask. And what's interesting about the nature of this virus is a couple of things. First of all, I think the wood has dodged a bullet. So this virus passes from person to person very easily, but usually doesn't kill people. But it does affect vulnerable people in a way that causes, 50% chance of death, which is why you see them digging mass graves in New York, which is simply extraordinary. We've dodged a bullet because if the properties of the virus were slightly different and you could be asymptomatic, so show no signs of the disease, but then it killed you in 2 weeks, right? We'd be really screwed. And so when the lockdown decision was made, it was absolutely the right one because knowledge of virus, even weeks later, is still low. Nobody knows. And so if we hadn't made the decision to lock down, then it could have been that the virus wasn't quite what we thought it was, and it started to kill people in ways that we had anticipated. And this is the challenge when you're operating in complex environments, is that you can't refer to best practice. You have to be making decisions based on sketchy and thin information in the best way possible. And so I think the lockdown response was absolutely right. The trick now is how do we emerge stronger from this? And if you look, the counterfactual at the time is very hard to argue because you can't, with imperfect knowledge, you can't argue either way. But New Zealand has the benefit of, I'm saying being lucky because we were extraordinarily lucky to be in the position we are now, lucky of looking at other countries at the time and saying, we can't afford to be Italy. And there was a clear precedent for where we would become Italy.
Thanks, Roger. You've touched on a theme that has come up through a number of questions, which is on how do we emerge from this? There's a group of questions on government, mobilizing people. So I'll theme them together. How do you influence for government to reimagine New Zealand, the new New Zealand? And if it is government, so there's part one to the question, which government entity is best placed to lead? And then the second part is if it's private sector who should, what groups should get involved? How do we actually tangibly tackle this? I appreciate it's a big question.
No, it's a good question and highly relevant. The trick of which parts of government to engage is still really not clear to me, even though I've been neck deep in this since February. And that's quite telling. So this sort of harks back to that analogy between EQC and SCIRT. So, EQC was an organisation that really tried to adapt its current operating model into something else and failed dismally, whereas SCIRT was an entirely new entity where they had considered how to operate in that environment and then push the button. So I don't think there is an existing avenue to have that conversation with government at the moment, but I think it needs to be something new, set up specifically for the purpose of having that joint approach going forward, because otherwise we could end up sort of in knowledge wave territory. So knowledge wave, and I'm presuming most people on the call will recall that I was overseas at the time, so I wasn't here for it. But knowledge wave essentially ended up where I think it was Helen Clark at the time made some sort of off the comment pushback, which was, I decide where the country goes, not knowledge wave. And in one short soundbite, essentially torpedoed an enormous amount of goodwill from the private sector. Now, if the private sector pushes too hard against government, that's a fairly natural pushback. But like I said earlier, you have to have this joined up approach going forward in order to stop this sort of zigzagging between where things are going to go.
Thank you. And
Did I answer both parts then? I think I did.
Yeah, it's a complex challenge, right? How do we get the synergy between all of these different groups to emerge victorious? This one's actually more targeted at business, this next question. In the context of a vision strategy, how might businesses set about a now, next, and later roadmap? With capital at a premium, isn't there a danger we'll continue to focus on today and not tomorrow?
Oh, absolutely there is. And there's a very, it's a very human trait to be focused on the most pressing adrenal demands. Right, so sort of hard baked into our physiology that you can't ignore that, and that's the challenge where you need three separate groups, because if you continue focusing on the immediate concerns, you won't have the headspace to start adapting and leveraging the opportunity. So, me personally, for example, some of my clients have actually doubled down on thinking about the opportunity, and they've done that because I've been working with them for 3 or 4 years and they're very comfortable in that space. Other clients I've been working with for a decade have really had to just sort of close the doors and really focus on how to just maintain business full stop, and their capacity to actually go beyond to think about opportunity is almost zero. So they're in survival mode. There is no easy answer to this, despite what any of your trusted advisors might tell you. There is no easy path through this. And so having those three different streams clear in your mind and giving license to the second and third stream to actually start to get beyond the immediate response is perhaps the best way I can think that you start to get away from that very adrenal reaction around just survive. So I know, personally for my own business, I've had some really interesting collaboration starting to develop with organisations that I wouldn't normally work with, and they're sort of away from what I've done for the last decade, but they're extremely interesting and moving at a pace I hadn't expected. And so one of the things that I was talking to clients about pre-lockdown was, this is coming. You should start thinking about your customers' pain points and start thinking about how you're going to solve that. Because if you don't start thinking about that now, that was pre-lockdown, when this all hits, you're not going to think about it at all, but position yourself early to help your customers through. And one of the things that surprised me in the last few days is conversations with organizations that aren't my clients, where it's very clear they're still in reaction mode, just heads down, adrenal survive mode. And so as organizations, if you can help your customers get above that or think them through some of the opportunities, that should be interesting conversations that hopefully spark insights to how you get through this.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time, so I'll group some questions together, which are broadly on the theme of tourism, encapsulated in this one. One massive opportunity for New Zealand and potentially the Pacific is to become the global tourist destination of choice, a COVID-free environment that is safe to visit. It would involve government and private sector involvement to create such an isolation getaway. How do you think we could achieve this?
I have to be very careful how I answer that, because that's one of the things I'm working on right now, is a process to make that viable. And the challenge with that process is that no, yeah, it's multi-organisations working together to get 4 to 6 weeks ahead of a government response, so that when the idea becomes very prominent, you have something ready to go. And that's what I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 weeks. One of the things. I'm
Sure.
happy to have conversations about that. People want to get in touch. Happy to have chats, but there's a degree of confidentiality around how that's working at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, given the sensitivities on that, given it's a project, I'll actually ask a different question. People are interested in your views on some US and China scenarios and their flow-on effect, intended or unintended, on New Zealand.
Yes. So the challenge here is I have colleagues around the world who are very seasoned China watchers, been doing it for the whole career, highly respected, some of the best Chinese analysts in the world. And the most insightful thing I got from one of them recently was anybody who tells you they think they know what's going on with China doesn't know what they're talking about. So China is deliberately opaque in how it messages its intentions. And the contrast to that is this orange-faced buffoon in the White House tweeting barely formed thoughts in crayon and changing his mind every day. And so that doesn't strike me as an environment which is conducive to a global response to this. But the highest level view is that countries will soon have to choose between aligning themselves to the US or to China. And the challenge is if you align yourself to the US, you really have no idea what that guy's going to do next. I mean, literally, diplomats I've spoken to, high-ranking diplomats, have just gone, we don't know. No one knows. Even his closest aides don't know. Whereas China, I don't think China wants to take over the world in the same way the US wanted to rule the world, but definitely wants to have the China way of thinking assume new importance in the world.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time. Our apologies that we couldn't answer all the questions that have come through. They've all been very impactful. So thank you for the input. Thank you very much to Roger and to Jane. It's been a very thought-provoking conversation.
And I'll make the offer, sorry, just to cut it off. If anyone wants to chat more, the offer is open. So I'm easy to find online, on Twitter and LinkedIn, on my website. You can ring me up and have a chat and mention this if you really want to. It's a genuine offer.
Thank you. I'm sure people might take you up on that. In our closing, we would like to invite you all to our upcoming webinar in a fortnight, keeping with this theme of leadership conversations. On June 11, our next speaker is Sasha McMeeking. Sasha was appointed head of Aotahi, the School of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Canterbury in 2015. She brings a serial entrepreneur's approach to working with and for iwi Māori. From instigating UN proceedings to architecting a Māori social enterprise fund and leading commercial negotiations, she's known for solution building that meets iwi Māori aspirations. Registrations are now open on our website, and we'll also email an invitation. Thank you also to everyone who has suggested topics for future webinars. We have gathered their data and are developing a pipeline accordingly. We would be grateful if you could...
Sasha is great. Highly recommend her. I'll be tuning in as well. She's
brilliant. We'd be grateful if you could please fill out a short survey of feedback after this webinar. And really importantly, we want to thank our team behind the scenes. Thank you, Amelia and Paul. You are legends. I look forward to staying connected with everybody online or in person when the time allows. Until then, stay safe. Kia kaha.
Thank you.